Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever you are. And welcome to our webinar, Industrial Application of Computational Fluid Dynamics, Opening a Realm of Possibilities. I'm Andres Donoso Bravo. I'll be your chairman today. It's a pleasure to see so many participants from all over join us to explore how CFD or Computational Fluid Dynamics it's working now to revolutionize the industry. So to introduce myself, I'm the CEO and senior researcher at Modela. Modela provides services and solutions based on mathematical modeling and computational tools such as CFD. We are trying to solve the industry sustainability challenges through the use of virtual prototyping and piloting. It's the way that we like to call it. AKI, also known as digital twins, although we really don't like that terms very much. It's been abused or misused in recent years, but a lot of people are using the terms of digital twin, mixing different techniques, machine learning and CFD and etc. So, well, CFD has unlocked a new era of simulation and analysis, offering unparalleled insights into the fluid dynamic challenges. So today, during this webinar, we'll dive into its practical application, from multi-phase system modeling to designing advanced substrates, virtual piloting in aquaculture, and beyond. So, before we begin, a quick overview of our agenda. Let me just share my screen for a moment. So a warm welcome to our speakers, Robert Hayes, Joan Baga, Ivan Cornejo, Fernando Zorrilla, and Maria Constanza Sadino. The order of the presentations is not quite like that, but we will cover these topics here that you may already be aware of. Each presentation will last around 15 minutes. Then we will have a Q&A session after the third presentation and a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So feel free to submit your question in the Q&A box on top of your screen, and we will try to address as many as possible during the Q&A session. Okay, I think without further ado, let's begin with our first topic, which is an introduction of computational fluid dynamics. Please welcome to our first speaker, Dr. Robert Hayes, Professor of Chemical Engineering at the University of Alberta and President and CEO of Alpha Fluid Associates. He's been working on CFD for over 40 years, with a specialization in catalytic system with an emphasis on environmental applications. So, Robert, you can start sharing your screen, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Andres, for that introduction. So, thank you. So what I'm planning to do in this talk is just to give you a kind of a very high-level overview of what CFD is all about, and just to give you the basics, okay? So this is not really meant to be a very highly technical talk. So if we look at the concept from the beginning, like what is mathematical modeling? Well, basically it's very simple. You simply have a physical system. Here I show a continuous stirred tank reactor, and you generally make some assumptions. You write down a bunch of mathematical expressions that you hope will describe the system. Now, models, of course, vary in complexity, so don't get hung up on the idea that we have to have an incredibly complicated model. On the left, we have something like a simple linear equation, and on the right, we have a bunch of partial differential equations. Okay, so the modeling is not necessarily complex, but it certainly can be. Okay, and what you have to appreciate, on the modeling complexity theme, that we have different types of models. At the the simplest end, we would have what we call a purely empirical model, where you have a bunch of experimental data, you write down some equations that are going to fit those data, and you don't pay any attention at all to the theory. Okay. At the other end, and it's kind of on the fantasy level, is a purely theoretical model where you just use fundamental theory and there would be no adjustable parameters. And you can almost never have a model like that. There's always going to be some kind of assumption to be made. And we could say that as you move from empirical to theoretical, the model gets better. That's not necessarily true, and most realistic models will fall between those two extremes. Okay, and there's lots of reasons why you want to use a model, and you should focus, I think, on the little thing in the red box at the bottom. Is before you start choosing a model, I think it's very important to understand what you want the model to do. Do you want to design something from first principles? You just want to try to correlate some experiments, etc. Okay, so be very, very sure what's the model is going to be used for, because that is going to determine to a certain extent the model that you are going to choose. We can make incredibly complicated models for very simple processes, but there's not really any point. Like, don't make the model more complicated than necessary. And just remember a very important point, that the model doesn't have to be perfect to be useful. Okay. And the quote in the speech bubble, it's usually attributed to Einstein, although there's no evidence that he actually said it. But just make the model as simple as possible, but don't oversimplify, because that can lead to errors. And I'm not sure if it's politically correct to use the KISS principles, which is basically keep it simple. Don't make things more complicated than they need to be. Having said all that, there's a whole world of mathematical modeling, and what we're really focusing on in today's webinar is what we would call chemical process models, or what I call chemical process models. And essentially what you're doing in a chemical process model is you're solving the basic momentum, energy, and mass balances. Well, you do that in any process, but in this context, we're really talking about transport phenomena, where all of the equations are going to have the form of complicated partial differential equations. Okay. And when you modeling that type of system, that's generally referred to as CFD models, for computational fluid dynamics. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer, because, of course, nowadays modern CFD modeling includes temperature and transport. So it's really should be called computational transport phenomena. But the first codes that people started dealing with were really solving Navier-Stokes equation, and that's why it's called computational fluid dynamics. Okay, and although it's not necessarily important for you to understand everything that's behind, in my little 3-ring overlapping system here, there you've got in the blue ring, you've got the transport phenomena. You have to solve those equations, and that's where the numerical methods comes in. And then you've got in the green hoop, you've got the computer science people who design, the software, etc. So it's all very important, and it all goes together. Okay, so that's kind of a crude introduction. Now, what do you do? What are the basic steps in building a CFD model? Well, from a global point of view, it's very simple. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have some kind of a physical system. Here we have a biofermentation reactor, and you're going to decide what are the equations that you're going to use. And you recognize that the equations you choose are always some simplification of reality. Okay, you're making assumptions. You're always going to be making simplifying assumptions, and you hope that they are the good ones. Okay, and now those equations have to be solved in the computer, so you have to translate everything into a form that the computer can understand. So the next step would be to take your physical system and build a computer readable geometry file. And here again, you see my mixer, and here we have all the details with the impellers, the sparger, the baffles, etc. This can be quite complicated to do, but fortunately we have good computer-aided design software that are helpful, and provided you know how to use those, they're a very, very good aid in building geometry. And for anything beyond simple 2D systems, you're certainly encouraged to use that software. Okay, so now what's the next problem? Okay, we cannot solve the equations in the CFD model analytically, so we have to use approximate solutions. These solutions have to be numerical. Okay, and essentially what you do is you take your big domain and you break it up into a bunch of little pieces. And you need to do that because you're approximating your partial differential equations with algebraic equations, and they're not accurate over the whole domain. So in a very global sense, what we have to do is divide the domain into a finite number of pieces, and that process is called discretization. And what you have to appreciate, again, here's my domain, and here's my mesh, and it's maybe the resolution is not the best, but here there's a combination of structured and unstructured meshing. And again, we're going to have good software tools that allow us to do that. What is important to appreciate in the whole CFD modeling process is that building this mesh, this discretized domain, is key and perhaps possibly the most important step in obtaining a reliable solution. If you don't have a good mesh, you will not have a good solution. And when you are doing your solution, you have to test very rigorously that the mesh has been built correctly. So at the end of this step, what you're going to have is a whole bunch of equations written over your domain, and then we have to solve those equations. Now, I'm not going to talk at all about solution methods, but just be aware that there are many different ways of solving equations, and the choice of solver that you choose is going to depend on the system you have. And commercial CFD codes, which I'll talk about in a minute, have all kinds of options, and it's very important that you choose the correct option. Okay. So what you're going to get now at the end of this solution is you're going to get the results, like the values of your variables, temperature, pressure, etc. They're going to be given at the mesh points, and then you have to interpret the results. Now, if you're doing a complicated 3D modeling study, especially transient, you're going to get terabytes of data, so visualizing them can be quite complicated. So again, I'm not going to talk about the exact techniques, but there's good software to do that. And here I'm just showing you some fancy results that were obtained from modeling this biofermentation reactor without going into the details. Pictures like this are very helpful for the eye to visualize what's actually going on. But also you might have simple graphs to track certain variables at certain locations in the domain. Okay. The point is you can make lots and lots of very flashy, pretty pictures. But again, coming back to it, you have to make sure that those results actually make sense. Okay. So just to summarize what I've just said is a kind of block diagram. You're going to start with a physical system. You're going to convert that to a model, and that will give you some error because your model is an approximation. you're going to convert your mathematical model into a discrete model on the discretized domain. That's going to give you some error. Then you're going to solve it and get your solution at your given points, and then there's going to be numerical error. And what's important to appreciate is that all of these steps in the solution are going to give you some error. Okay, you can't get away from it. And this slide just kind of summarizes the different sources of errors. I'm not going to read everything, but the model error basically comes from maybe incorrect assumptions, not really representing the reality correctly. Discretization error, you don't make the mesh properly, and that must be tested. And unfortunately, there are techniques for doing that. Of course, the third one is where you just screw up when you're inputting the data, and that can be hard to find. And then finally, the numerical errors, which come from the solver. And again, there are methodologies, tested methodologies for looking at those errors, but it's super, super important that you examine the errors in your system. And that really brings us to the, to the final topic of validation. Well, validate. What do I mean by validation? Well, validation is the idea of proving that your model is giving you an acceptable level of accuracy. Again, there are books written on how to validate models, but they basically they have to reproduce your experimental data. And if they do that, at least that means the model is reproducing your experimental data. Well, that's a little bit of a cheeky statement, but that's really all it says. Because in the red box, I say, unfortunately, no model can ever be completely or perfectly validated and verified, because there's always going to be some experiment that you don't try that that maybe it doesn't fit on. Okay, so these are just things to keep in mind. Now, at the end of the day, when I started, as Andre said, about 40 years ago, I wrote my own finite element codes. Well, nobody does that anymore because it's too complicated and it's also a waste of time. So you're going to use a commercial code. I'm not here to do any advertising, but these ones on the screen here are the most popular ones. The first three are finite volume codes. Then COMSOL is a very nice package in finite element. OpenFOAM is a free package, so you don't have to pay for it, but it's a lot more difficult to use, or requires more experience. Okay. And the reality is that anybody today who's doing serious CFD modeling is going to use commercial codes or open source codes. You're not going to waste time writing your own. If you're for the academic audience, the good thing is you can usually get these at a significant discount. The bottom two bullet points are the most important ones that, and I'm going to read them. When used with care by knowledgeable users, CFD codes can be an enormously powerful design tool, and that's very, very true. If you don't know what you're doing, you can get lots of very nice, pretty pictures, but at the end of the day, they don't mean anything. They might satisfy your management who don't know anything about CFD, but they won't be very useful. So I guess I would say commercial codes are user friendly. They make a lot of effort. The companies make a lot of effort to make them friendly. And you can install them on your system or have someone do it, run the tutorials to figure out how to do the input, and you get pretty results. But that doesn't necessarily mean the results are correct. Okay. What I'm trying to get, the message I'm trying to get on, I keep beating on it, is that be very, very skeptical of CFD results. I'm not saying they're always wrong, but CFD modeling does have to be done correctly. And my last words of wisdom, and then I have a short example to show you. Once you've got a really beautiful, verified CFD model, the worst thing you can do is use those models to predict results that are outside of the experimental data range. Okay. In other words, don't extrapolate, results. It's like predicting the future based on the present. Go back to an issue of Popular Mechanics, if you know that magazine from the 1950s, and see what they were predicting we were going to be today. Well, half the population of Earth was going to be living on the moon. So it doesn't work. Really, really dangerous to extrapolate. And in general, the more theoretically based the model is, the better it's going to work. But even then, extrapolating can be dangerous. Okay, so that's the end of the formal bit, and I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an insight into what CFD modeling is about. And now I'm just going to show you a very short example. I'm not going to give you a lot of technical details. It's just that we're pretty proud of this project. And this was a system where the client wanted a catalytic reactor to combust low concentration lean methane. And so you have like 1% methane in air at room temperature. You're not allowed to preheat you're not allowed to preheat the feed, and the reactor has to burn the methane. And so basically what we do, we have to design a catalytic reactor with an internal feed preheat, like we have to do an internal energy recuperation. So we did a little bit of brainstorming, did some preliminary design analysis, and finally we came up with this type of design, which we call the snail design. So you have it's a counterflow design. The feed comes in one side. It curls around the snail, where it's in counterflow with the hot effluent. The catalyst is located in the center, and if you get the operating conditions correct, it should work. That was the idea. So we do some CFD analysis to study the operating range, and without going into all the details, you can see this is a temperature projection, and we were able to demonstrate that provided we could ignite the system, we could maintain temperatures to get methane combustion with room temperature feed. Well, that's very cool. We can design it and show that it works in the computer. Well, the client wanted to see that it would work in the lab, so we built this is when I say same size here, this pilot scale unit was the same size as CFD. It's smaller than the desired production unit. So basically we built this, we did a whole bunch of tests, and at the end of the day, without showing you the results, I would say that the model predictions were exactly what we got experimentally, which was amazingly cool, we thought. Perfect CFD design. So we went directly to scale up to full production size. Of course, we designed that in the computer. We do CFD analysis to make sure we'd get good flow distributions, temperatures, etc., because it was a much bigger unit. And at the end of the day, it worked. And then we went right away and built the demonstration unit. And here it is installed down in the coal mine, and it works very well. And basically, we're processing 50 meters cubed per minute of ventilation air methane, and we use the energy to drive the air conditioning. So, summary, this was a completely CFD-driven design. We only had built one pilot reactor, and we did direct scale up with just CFD. So this was a huge savings in time and cost. And now what we've been asked to do is optimize and scale up the design by a factor of 10. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll stop sharing the screen and turn it back to the chair.
Thank you, Robert. Very insightful presentation. A quick overview about what it's CFD all about, and then very interesting real case application. Thank you. So we are going to move to this next presentation. We are going to have the Q&A first section at the end of the third presentation. So please drop your questions there in the Q&A part of the Teams platform. Okay, so Now we will continue exploring another CFD application. Let me introduce you to Dr. Joe Mbaga, Principal Process Engineer at Alpha Fluid Associate, also teaching professor in chemical engineering at the University of Alberta, Edmonton, Canada, expert on computational modeling of industrial processes. So Joe, over to you. You can share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Andres. I hope you can all see my screen. And
all good.
My talk is going to be structured along 4 questions. That is what, why, how, and what then. So in the how, I'm also going to present some case studies which we've done for clients. And in the what then, I'm going to present what comes after we've seen all these cool pictures. So first, the what. A multi-phase system is a system where we have 2 or more phases, being liquid or gas or solid, and they're all interacting dynamically. Now, this leads to what we could say either it's a gas liquid, in case we are talking about maybe bubble columns here, or it can be liquid solid if you are talking about maybe slurry transport, or it can even be gas solid when you are talking about maybe fluidized reactors. Now, be all what it may, this is an extension above what you heard from the first presentation, that we are now going to add some more things or more issues which are going to come. In particular, we look at the interfacial momentum transfer, or also we have to look at the distribution of the phases and their holdup, as well as the turbulence, because now in the presence of additional things in the system, the turbulence can be affected by the particles. And last but not least, we also have to take account of just the interaction between and amongst the particles. Now, having said that, then we need to have some approach. We can either consider all the phases just to be a continuum interpreting, whereby we now, all the equations which are available are going to be solved for each phase on its own. And therefore they need to be coupled. And if you use the Eulerian method, then the coupling is mostly just using models. Now, this approach, of course, will be more suitable when you got dense mixtures, but it won't be accurate very much for maybe following the particles. But again, since it is just for simple system, we can, at least the cost for computation here is not that much. Now, the other approach would be to treat each phase separately and then track the particles again individually. So therefore, this is going to be much more computational heavy, but then the accuracy is much higher than the first method here, Eulerian method. And also in the case then, since we are going to be doing all these calculations for all the particles, then we are just limited to dilute systems, and that will be something which is less than 10% in concentration. Now, coupled to these methods, we also require to be able to track the interface in the case when we have immiscible fluids. So in this case, then we have a method like the volume of fluid or the level set method. And as well, if we want to maybe follow the distribution of particles, or maybe the growth or maybe coalescence of particles, again, we have this submodel, which is the population balance model. So the matter of fact is the methods are only 2, and these 2, you can say that they are kind of subsets of the first method. They're like the volume of fluid method and the level set would be Eulerian, a subset of that. Whereas if you're talking about DEM or maybe DPM, you'll be following this method here. Now, what then to do? Why does this matter? It matters because we want to be able to, in order to be able to understand properly and be able to design and optimize industrial processes, sometimes we want to find the efficiency. Maybe we are dealing with the cyclones, which I'm going to show an example for that. Or it may just be a matter of safety. Maybe in a pipeline, the particles are going to cause erosion. So therefore, you need to know the locations where this phenomenon can happen. And the last but not least, it has to do with the quality. Maybe in a graduation process or in a deposition process, you want to do that. And in that case, then CFD can help us to understand this much better. Now, what will be the tools? You already heard about the tools from the first presentation, but here I want to emphasize one additional tool, because the previous tools from the first presentation, the ANSYS and the console, they're all, we say, general purpose. There's this additional tool here, MFIX, which is multi-phase flow with interface exchange. This is purely dedicated for just only multi-phase. And this, so if anyone say is new to multi-phase, this will be the package we recommend, because, okay, first of all, it is free, but also it is supported by US National Lab. So I'll say it's very accurate. And so if you're new to multi-phase, this is the starting point. And one of the reasons why this is a good starting point is because it has, since it is only focusing on multi-phase, then there are a lot of templates whereby if you just say, I want to do a cyclone, then automatically it will bring you actually a model of a cyclone, and then you can proceed for that. So the learning curve is a bit smooth than compared, say, to this cousin here, which is open form, which is also free, but probably maybe the learning curve is a bit steep. Now, again, the validation which was spoken in the first presentation applies here. So for all the work we do, we have to validate, and that's what I'm going to try to show in my examples. So I have 4 case studies. I will go a bit because most of these are client information, so I won't talk too much about some of the sizes and the dimensions. However, the last example here, I'll be more open to a lot of things, and I'll be showing more what was done exactly. Now, in the first example, a client, this is an international client who wanted to venture into Alberta oil sands, and they needed to understand the challenges which they're going to face when you have a very large area where you can get your bitumen, but you want to be processing at one place. So the task was to figure out and understand the flow behavior of this bitumen as you transport it along long distance. And so this required 2 parts. First, experimental part to see how the flow works. So this was subcontracted to another lab, and we were contracted to do the CFD part based on the lab results. Now, this figure here shows very clearly that at least for the first part, where one of the critical parameters was a pressure drop, and the pressure drop was quite well matched with the experiments. Let me just experiments as shown here. And so we are confident with what we're doing. Now, the next part was to see one of the phenomena whereby the mixture here is bitumen, which is a bit heavy oil, and it's difficult to transport this unless one can modify at least the wall interactions. So we want to see if we can reproduce what we call core annular flow. Okay, 1 second. Now, for this part here, what we are trying to, again, this is still a validation whereby we are looking at the varying temperature based on experiments and the CFD, which we could match very well, as well as varying velocity. Again, the CFD was matching very well with what was shown experimentally. So now comes the next part to demonstrate the core annular flow. So in this case, on the left side here, we have the inlet of the pipe where everything is perfectly mixed. And the idea is to see how the particles or the emulsion, if you like, will disaggregate such that we are going to have a light fluid only covering the walls and the heavy part on the center. So now this was able to be demonstrated very clearly here that yes, as you move along the pipeline, you can establish this condition where for all intents and purposes, this can be considered just like a water only flowing, although we have a very viscous fluid here, which is your bitumen and also heavy in density. But with establishing the right flow conditions, the bitumen will migrate to the center of this pipe and leaving a very thin layer at the sides of the pipe. And therefore, the pressure drop is very much close to what one will see in, say, a fluid like water flowing around. So this was a success, and the client was able to proceed. Well, I don't know if this project was actually built, but at least there was a flow assurance that, yes, you can use CFD to elucidate what will happen when a mixture of, a complicated mixture of bitumen and water under different conditions can work under these parts. Now, the second case here is a different client. This will be fertilizer manufacturer. So in this case, the client had an issue. First, this, what you see on the right at the top here is what we call a granulator. So the nozzle where they spray the fertilizer, I mean the slurry or fertilizer, so that it can be dried. Now, what they were experiencing for this particular geometry was heavy fouling. And so what the client did was to change the nozzles. So instead of having this kind of nozzles, they said, maybe let's put just a straight pipe, because the only function, at least what they thought at that time, was that the action of these nozzles is just to inject the slurry into the rotating drum where it is dried. Now, the problem was solved. The fouling problem was solved, but they introduced a different problem, because now they were increasing the emissions, and mostly hydrogen fluoride was increasing, and therefore they could not meet the emission standards. Now, again, what they decided to do was to increase the length of these nozzles, and the fouling decreased, but it did not, I mean, the emissions, at least it decreased, but still it was not eliminated. So the question, what is going on? And that's where we came in, whereby there must be some hydrodynamic phenomena, because their product, the product which they were making, the fertilizer, there was no change, there's no issue at all. The only issue had to do with the nozzle. So now, what can CFD tell us about this? So what we did was to carry out multi-phase for all the three geometries. So now what you are seeing here, really, this is the model we made of the client's geometry. And then we carry out simulations for each of them. So in the first case, now this is the original case where they were experiencing a lot of fouling. And you can see that, well, these are velocity vectors. We can see that there is a region behind the nozzle here, which is almost a dead zone. And this can be seen much better when you look at velocity streamlines. So clearly, the reason for the fouling had to do with this dead zone here. Now, what if we now did the same flow, but with the second case? So in this case, the second case was a straight nozzle. And yes, they were able to eliminate the fouling problem. But as I said, still now they experience the higher emissions. Now with the third case, again, they increased the length of the nozzle, and also it was kind of bent. And yes, there's no dead zones, and therefore that's why the fouling was eliminated, but still the emission were not there. In other words, then the original problem, which was more of a reliability problem because they had to change the system more than what they wanted, they had planned. Now the problem has been turned into an environmental problem. It was now more on a regulation because they are not meeting the standards. Now, in evaluating this situation, what we found is that there must be something at the local scale. Therefore, we had to compare the turbulence intensity as well as the energy dissipation rate. And what we see from here is that, yes, for their case, for the regional case, which I'm calling here case 1, the turbulence intensity is much higher than the rest of the 2 cases. Whereas in the first case, when they shortened this nozzle, it's almost 5 times less. And when they increased a bit the length and they also made it a bit of a bend, it was increased maybe, but it's still 3 times less. Now, so with this understanding, because remember now, this client was a sophisticated client. They knew they had a problem and they had a solution. It's just that they didn't understand what was the cause of the problem. From the CFD calculations, it was clear that now they have to increase the length or at least make sure that this zone, the nozzle, were there not just to spray this slurry, but rather there is some kind of conditioning happening here at the very low scales. And with this knowledge, the client was able to, well, solve the problem and go and continue with their production. Now, with the next case, this was a different client. In this case, there's a gasification unit. And the issue again was to do with the fouling and erosion. And mostly this was in, so the first unit here is a gasifier, and it was gasifying asphaltene. And next to the gasifier, we have a cooler because we get a syngas, what we call syngas. And in this cooler, that's where issues came, mostly in the bend. So you can see at the bottom bend here, or in the coil itself, or the top bends, all of these places, they were experiencing 2 things. First, the fouling, but also the erosion. Now, from measurements, they could see, so if you pick one bend, this is what was found, that you could even have holes in some of the bends. So carrying out CFD simulation around this geometry, we are able to show, yes, in these corners, in the bends, that's where you have had the highest erosion rate. Now with that, then the suggestion to the client was that, well, you should change the radius. So we tried to compare 2 different radii, a large bend radius and a small bend radius. And if you can see the numbers here, the erosion rate is almost halved by simply just increasing the radius. So what the client had to do now is to revert back to using large radius bends in all their pipes, and the problem was eliminated. Now, my last case here, which I think I hope I have time to talk about that, is the hydrocyclone separator. There's this particular device. It's not a very big device, but it's a very popular device in pulp and paper operations, and also in oil sands. And the task here, or the idea, was really just to get a basic understanding of how this device works and how to improve the design.
One more minute, Joe. We have a tight schedule.
Sure. So I'm just gonna describe how this works. The biggest part here was really to come up with the geometry for that, and how to establish the core, or because the key to hydrocyclone separation is to be able to have a very good air core at the center. And we can see that it was able to be captured. The elements here were hexahedral and about 500,000, and the whole phenomenon was captured. Plus, we are able to also verify the flow split as well as the size of the core. Now, with this knowledge, then it was possible to continue and do the design. Now, if you, for any more information, you can see this is a published information. It can be found in this paper. And what is the end of this? There are, of course, challenges. Computational costs can be high due to the complex calculations. Likewise, also the accuracy of the models depends on how one can select. And of course, they all require validation. Now, future trends, the way you see it is that machine learning is going to be integrated into this, as well as having more high-performance computers and advanced models. And to conclude then, multi-phase flow modeling, of course, provides critical insight into complex phenomena, and their applications are quite wide, as shown. And the call for you is to explore these tools if you want to succeed in a field. And the Alpha and the Modela, of course, would like to be your partner in CFD. Thank you.
Thank you for the nice presentation. It's nice to see new tools like the one you just showed that people that are working on CFD can also tap into, apart from the traditional software. And the case of corrosion is very crazy that you guys were able to predict the exact position where the corrosion was gonna take place. It's very, very crazy. Thank you. So our next speaker before the first Q&A part, it's Ivan Cornejo. He's an associate professor and vice chair of the Chemical and Engineering Department at University Santa Maria in Chile, president of the board at the National Hydrogen Institute, and expert in advanced computational modeling. Currently focused on green hydrogen and sustainable fuels. So Ivan, please go ahead. The e-floor is yours.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I'm just sharing the presentation. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
We see you and hear you.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about CFD-guided design of advanced substrates for catalytic reactors in the context of producing derivatives from green hydrogen. Of course, that we there is currently accepted in the community that we have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, for example. And when we talk about that, we're not talking only about fuel for cars, but also for many materials that we use a lot in everyday, like for example, fibers and plastics. All of them currently come from fossil fuels, but it is also possible to do fuel, textiles, and, for example, plastic pipes from green hydrogen and captured CO2 from the atmosphere. So in that way, we can do identical chemical species that we can use, but with reduced carbon footprint. Of course, that there are many challenges related to this. It is like today, fossil fuels are cheap, are inexpensive. We basically do a dig in the ground, and then the oil comes up. But when we use hydrogen and CO2, we have to combine the molecules and build some bigger molecules with using temperature, pressure, and catalyst. Of course, that one important species in between of all of this is methanol. Methanol it can be synthesized from hydrogen and CO2 and can be used to produce many alternative fuels, for example, DME, but also some identical to the natural ones, such as gasoline, synthetic LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, and so on, and also some materials, for example, polyethylene, polypropylene. How methanol is done in chemical reactors? Well, basically we mix CO2 and hydrogen in a reactor. I'm not going to go into the details because it is too boring. But with temperature and pressure, mixing these molecules in the presence of a catalyst, we can form new molecules, in this case methanol. Despite that, the temperature and the pressure that we use, we still do not have high yields or performance. So we have to separate the reactants that did not react inside of the reactor, compress them again, and then passing them again through the reactor. That forces the reactor to be bigger and also to separate a lot. In this process, it is expensive having the equipment, but also the separation process is quite expensive. So and recompression. So if I can have a better performance in the reactor, and I have to recirculate less and recompress less, or the pressure drop inside of the reactor is lower, then I have savings, and I can reduce the cost of producing these derivatives such as methane. Okay, so everything here is happening inside of the reactor in there. Those reactors in industry are quite big. Here I have some examples from a liquid to gas, gas to liquid plant in Qatar. Here we see the picture. The plant has 12 of those reactors. Every reactor has many tens of thousands of tubes, and are more than 10 meters long each. So quite big. Inside of those reactors, typically we have many tubes. Inside of every tube, we have the catalyst where the chemical reactions occur. In the example here, we have monolith. The most common catalyst support is pellet currently, but well, and in the example we have monolith. In every tube, we have many monoliths. Inside of every monolith, we have many channels. And in the inner walls of the channels, we have the catalyst. So for modeling what is happening inside of every pore of every channel of every monolith of every tube is quite challenging. And of course, that every time that we want to try a new operating condition, for example, or new reactor design, it is not possible to build physically the entire equipment, or at least it's not cost efficient. So as the other speakers said, computational models are quite useful for fast prototyping and trying different conditions and saving time and materials. Of course, that inside of the tubes we can have monoliths, but also we can have pellets, which is the most common option, and some foams, for example. And there are many scales involved, because the reactors, of course, are quite big, many meters long, but the chemical reactions occur in a very small scale. So the size of these tubes is limited because of the center of the tube the temperature in the center of the tube rises quite a lot. The tubes are externally cooled to maintain the temperature below some level to avoid damaging the tubes and the catalyst also. So I would like to have bigger tubes, like with a bigger diameter, but it is not possible because of the center of the tube. In the center of the tube, the temperature is too much. The chemical reaction is too intense. So here I have an example with a automotive catalytic converter. In the center of the reactor, we have a quite high temperature, but in the periphery, the temperature is quite lower. So we thought, what happens if we can change the substrate in a way to distribute the flow, to have more heat in the periphery and less heat released in the axis of the reactor, so we can have a more flat temperature profile. We proposed a substrate with different configuration in the center and in the periphery. And when we tried to estimate what would be the performance of such a reactor, we found out that there were no models able to predict how the flow distributes in such substrates. So what we were looking for was trying to find out a model able to predict how much of the flow is going to pass through the center region and through the periphery region without doing experiments. So we used CFD models. First, we made a computational model, as we see here in the figure, with two different channel sizes in the center and in the periphery of the monolith, and changing the ratio between the channel size, which affects how much of the flow goes through every part, and also the size of the core was also a variable of interest to find out how much of the flow we want to go through the periphery. We did a parametric study trying different core sizes, which is the percentage of the substrate that has bigger channels in this example. And also having a fixed core size and changing the ratio between the size of the channels in each region. We found the effect of such variables in the core velocity in this case. And then doing some mathematical modeling, some mass balance. I'm not going to go into the details in this, but we found out a model able to predict how the flow distributes depending on the analyzed variables. And then we did some non-dimensionalization, and I found out that the theoretical model agrees quite well with the CFD predictions. The theoretical model was, let us say, new. So needed to be experimentally validated, similar to the CFD model. So after doing a vast parametric study, we selected some more promising configurations or some configurations where the flow is more different between cases. And we did experimental rig. We built an experimental rig. Here we can see a tube, and in the last part of the tube, we have an apparatus with a monolith inside. Those physical monoliths were identical to those in the computational model, but were 3D printed. We see here the picture, different combinations of core size and channel size ratio. And then we did some experimental runs. According to the results, we can see here that the CFD model agrees quite well with the experiments. Of course, that we did everything that Bob and Joe mentioned about grid study, and all kind of validations. But this is like the strong test comparing CFD results with experiments and with our theoretical proposed model. In this case, everything came quite good, finding that at the end of the day, we could have validated the theoretical model only using CFD, but because the CFD model resulted quite reliable. But of course, we wanted more proof that the model was correct, so we did the experiment. But this is kind of interesting because in some cases, computational power now is cheaper, and models are each time more sophisticated. So if we follow some rigorous procedure and we take care on every step of the when building a computational model, we can have quite reliable data from the computational models themselves. So this is an example on how we had a kind of a crazy idea, then build a simulation, build computational model, did simulation, selected some very specific cases to do the physical prototypes, and then next step is trying this in cold flow with chemical reactions, which is of course much more expensive, but we will try only one substrate configuration. So bottom line, CFD is quite a good catalyst for research and development, for fast prototyping, saving not only time, but also economical resources. And of course, that enables us to have faster results, cheaper. And last but not least, I would like to highly thank some of my students working with me in the picture. That's everything, Andres. I'm back to you.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for showing us this application about like it's monolith and well, have a couple of questions that I'm gonna ask in a little bit. Okay, thank you, Ivan. Now we are gonna answer a couple of questions that we've got here. The first one I think is for Robert. How important is validation? It's normal to question whether the model or the experiments are telling the truth. That's a pretty good question, actually.
Yeah, well, yes, I would say validation is essential. Without validation, your model can go to the shredder. And there's different concepts of validation. There's validating that the model has been executed correctly in the computer, like I talked about, mesh size studies, for example. And if your model does not accurately tell you what the experimental results are going to be, well, it's useless, of course, but you have to have confidence that it's giving you the correct results. So, yes, you have to validate that it is 100% essential.
Okay.
I don't know if that's sufficient, but yeah, it's
pretty good answer. So there is another question again. How much time was required to run the simulations? I assume that it was also for you for the study case that you presented.
So, sorry, is that a question for me?
Yes. How much time was required to run those simulations?
Which ones?
The study case that you show.
The snail.
Sorry. Say again. The reactor studies or the mixing studies, the biofermentation.
The snail.
Oh, the snail. Yeah.
System?
Okay. That's a good question. It depends on what you're including in the model, but those take of the order of anything from, say, minutes, like an hour, up to days if you're doing all the complicated reactions with transient studies. If you're modeling the startup, it's a lot more time consuming. But if you artificially start it up, shall we say, we're using numerical tricks, and you're just modeling the steady state energy balance with imposed sources, then it's of the order of a half an hour or something like that. So it really varied, but 3D transient startup was a lot more expensive.
Okay, thank you. So there is another question by Tomas here. Maybe Ivan or Joe can answer as well. What criteria can be used to determine when transitioning from a steady state simulation to a transient or free surface simulation is necessary? Any thoughts on that? Any criteria when transitioning from steady state to transient?
Okay, maybe if I can answer from the point of view, say, the hydrocyclone I showed there, we did transient initialization first until we see some steady state, and then we go to the next one. So really, you have to look at the flow field and get some consistency. Then you can go to the next level.
Okay. So what kind of parameter do you look at to determine if it's time to move to a steady state, like velocity profiles? Do you actually reach steady state, or is like a pseudo steady state?
Okay, that's a good. Okay, I don't know. I don't have the pictures here, but for that granulation thing there, where we showed 3 nozzles, yes, we are following the velocity until when the outlet flow rate is just constant. And we were able to see that for all the 3 nozzles, because they are at different distances, then they reach the steady state differently. For example, like the last one, it took much longer. But yes, so flow rate will be the main thing if you are doing transient to see where you will reach a point of a plateau.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I have a question for Ivan regarding the monolith. So, first, how did you build the monolith in 3D? Did you use like a scan sort of or laser machine that can be digitalized, or it was like very manual work? And then the reactions that take place in that reactor were like set up on the surface of the monolith. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, in this case, we did the 3D the digital models to say in AutoCAD, Autodesk Inventor. It is it has some special tools for doing some repetitive structures. So you can just do the cylinder and then one channel and then tell the software repeat. So everything is quite easy. It's not a problem. Autodesk Inventor. And then the chemical reactions in them, it really depends because there are some substrates that are made themselves of from some catalytic material. In the case that we were observing the substrate, there is a layer of catalyst added to the inner walls of the channel. So the reaction occurs in the volume of that layer, but that layer is so thin that can be considered just a surface.
Okay. Well, thank you. I hope that we answer the question that were asked. Hopefully we'll have more things to talk about during the next section of Q&A that will be at the end of the presentation. Now let's move to the fourth presentation. So our next speaker is Maria Constanza Sadino. She's the co-founder and senior process engineer at Modela. She has a background in biotechnology engineering and holds a PhD in chemical engineering. Constanza has implemented numerous CFD models for industrial processes, including aquaculture and desalination. So, Constanza, you can start.
Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So I'm not going to talk much about the details of the CFD models. My idea is that you can understand what kind of variables we can study with these models and which kind of information we can get from it. Okay, so I will showcase the virtual prototypes we have implemented for desalination and agriculture industry in Chile. So let's start with aquaculture. Aquaculture is the controlled farming of aquatic organisms such as fish and mollusks. Offshore aquaculture is conducted on fenced or enclosed sections of open water away from the shore, where the species are exposed to natural conditions such as water currents. Aquaculture is an important economic activity in Chile. Okay, Chile is the second largest producer of salmon and Chilean mussel in the world. And as we can see in the graph, aquaculture production in Chile has experienced significant growth over the years. And this trend is expected to continue because salmon farming is more sustainable than other sources of protein. However, offshore aquaculture faces a significant challenge: the harmful algal blooms. This photo shows an offshore farming site in the south of Chile, and we can see the water covered by a brown tide here, produced by blooms of harmful microalgae. Their growth consumes the dissolved oxygen in water, generating anoxic processes, problems in the gills of the fish, and their subsequent death by suffocation. Over the years, these events have become more frequent due to both natural and anthropogenic causes, climate change being one of them. And so this situation poses a serious threat for the aquaculture industry. To minimize and mitigate the effects of the algal blooms, the fish farms use different systems based on air diffusers. The upwelling systems are located underneath the fish cages. The air bubbles bring water free of algae from deep layers of the water body to the upper levels to dilute the algae and also to increase the oxygen availability. The second systems are bubble curtains surrounding the fish cages to create a physical barrier to keep algae away. So the design and operation of these systems is key, but testing the system offshore is expensive and difficult, and testing them on swimming pools could be less effective in replicating the water body conditions. So here is where CFD modeling can be of great help. So I'm going to show you the virtual prototypes that we implemented for the company Camanchaca that has fish farms in the south of Chile. So to accurately predict the performance of an air diffusers, we need to use a multi-phase CFD model. Okay, and we need to include key elements such as the perforation size and distribution, because that will affect the bubbles formation, the fluid properties such as density, viscosity, temperature, and salinity, because that will affect the bubbles transport and also the oxygen mass transfer. And also we need to include the marine current profile, because we can find different magnitudes and directions of the marine current as a function of the water depth, and that is going to change the bubbles movement as well. So we need all those variables in the model. Of course, we have to decide which one depending on the goal of the simulation. So with the right model, we can test a hypothesis regarding the design of a system. For example, in this case, we tested to see whether bubbles coalesce or not. So we have two perforations injecting air bubbles in opposite directions, and it was expected for them to rise in independent bubble columns. But we were able to see that they behave differently. Okay, they coalesce and they form just one column that is deviated by the marine current. Okay, so this is the kind of information that we can obtain with these simulations. In this case, we use a 2D CFD model, but we can also use 3D models. For example, to compare different technologies' performance through virtual prototypes. So in this case, this other case, we implemented two upwelling systems. They have different configurations, and we wanted to compare their performance. So you can see on the left, we have this cross shape, and on the right, we have concentric rings. They have different perforation size and distributions. So with the simulation, we were able to identify which system lifts more water per cubic meter of injected air. And this information is very important for the company, because based on that, they can select the best upwelling system for the specific farming site. Based on a technical aspect, they need as much fresh water as possible, but also from an economical point of view, because air injection is energy consuming, so that costs money. So with this information, they can evaluate the trade-off between these variables. In another project, the company wanted to know how effective would be a bubble curtain. So we implemented a model where we could measure the flow entering the farming site in order to know how much water with algae could be diverted from it. Okay, and we were able to measure how much of the 100% of water that could enter the site without the bubble curtain, only 60 to 70 could enter the site using the system. So that allows us to have an idea of the efficiency of the protection of the system. And also, we can use these models to understand the algal bloom movement and how much dilution we can achieve with these upwelling systems. So for that, we can model the algae bloom as a tracer dragged by the sea current. And we can consider the depth of that algal bloom, as well as the depth of the system. And we can measure how much algae is penetrating the system with the bubble column operating in the site. And we can see that there is a significant reduction of the algal present. All these simulations that can give us very important information to take decisions have a significant computational cost. So we can understand the complexity of the model, as Dr. Hayes explained in the first presentation. In this case, we have huge length scale differences. We have the water body that can have a domain with an extension of 100 meters, and we have the micro perforations of a few millimeters. So it requires a demanding mesh refinement to be able to capture the bubble movement. So you can see here on the image on the right that these blue colors is actually very small cells that are trying to capture the movement of the bubbles. Also, we have to capture very well the velocity gradients in the injection zone and also the interface between water and air in the surface. Therefore, these simulations require using 100 CPUs to simulate a few seconds of aeration until achieving a pseudo-steady state, and that could take around 10 to more days of execution of the simulation. Also, it creates terabytes of data that is used to quantify later on the relevant indicators and also to generate these videos that you are seeing in this presentation. So that's about aquaculture. Now let's talk about desalination. Desalination is the removal of salts from seawater, making it suitable for human consumption, irrigation, and industrial uses. And today, this process is key for addressing global water scarcity issues. As the water scarcity increases, the desalination industry has grown globally, and Chile is no exception. Currently, Chile has 24 desalination plants, most of them located in the northern regions, producing more than 8,000 liters per second of fresh water. And it is expected to double its production capacity by 2030 to supply the demand of the mining industry and also of the population. Together with the fresh water, the desalination process also produces brine, which is concentrated saline water that is released into water bodies such as the ocean. So as the desalination industry grows, the brine discharge has also increased, raising concerns about the environmental impact the brine could have on the sea. The brine has 2 times more salt than seawater. So if it is not properly mixed with the seawater, the aquatic organisms are exposed to higher salt concentrations that could modify the ecosystem. So to achieve a better mixing, the brine discharge has to be controlled by spreading the discharge and discharging with an outfall pipe farther offshore where the marine currents are stronger. This is an example of an outfall pipe that is located in the north of Chile. So again, CFD modeling can be of great help to optimize the design and operation of the brine discharge systems, okay, in order to have an efficient dilution of the brine with the seawater. So now we are going to review the scope of the virtual prototypes that Modela implemented for the company Candelaria that has a desalination plant in the north of Chile. So to have an accurate simulation of the brine discharge, we need to capture the effect of key elements again, but in this case, these key elements will affect the brine plume dispersion. So we need the bathymetry, because the brine is discharged close to the sea bottom where the surface irregularities play a role. We need to include the fluid properties, because water temperature and salinity affect the water density, and the density gradients are responsible for the buoyancy of the plume. So it's very important to have these variables in the model. And also it's very important to have the marine current profile because the plume will be transported by this current. With all these variables on a CFD model, we can predict the plume behavior to estimate the impact that the brine discharge has on the quality of water surrounding the outfall and also the potential environmental impact due to high salinity. So you can see here in this video that the plume is being transported by the current to the right of the screen, and also we can see the different colors that represent the different salinity, the salt concentration. So we have these red colors, we have a higher concentration of salt. Also, the CFD models have the capability to capture the outfall configuration with the diffuser's geometry and the operating conditions, and that allows us to analyze accurately the mixing factors, such as the marine current deviation, but also turbulence and the molecular diffusion. So here you see how the diffusers are affecting the marine current. They are being deviated and also being recirculated around the diffusers. The virtual prototypes help us to collect information that otherwise would be difficult or too expensive to measure experimentally, or sometimes impossible. And more importantly, it helps us to test hypotheses regarding the optimal operating conditions. And sometimes it helps us to confirm if our intuition is right or not. Let's analyze this case. Our intuition may say that a smaller flow of brine will produce less environmental damage than a bigger flow. However, that is not necessarily true. When the flow is too small, that it doesn't create turbulence around the discharging point, the mixing will be poorer. And therefore, the zone with high salinity will extend farther. So potentially, it will generate a greater damage on the sea life. And that was what we were able to see with these simulations. In the case of the right-hand side of the video, that one has a smaller flow, but you can see the yellow zones are bigger and are more extended than in the video of the left side. And that is because of the absence of turbulence. So just to finish the presentation, I would like to share a takeaway message. Currently, a more sustainable and environmentally friendly industry is needed with urgency, and the virtual prototypes could help us to achieve that goal. So it's a good tool that we should use. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanza, for the presentation with two real large-scale applications. I have a question about boundary conditions for the Q&A section number 2 regarding the difference with this and the other cases that the other speakers have shown. Okay, let's move to the last speaker of today's webinar. Fernando Zorrilla is a physicist specialized in simulation and modeling and data science as well at Modela. With a mixed background between research and industry projects, he has a wide experience designing and implementing multiphysics models. So, Fernando, you can share your screen and
okay, thank you,
go
Andres.
ahead with your presentation.
So let's go with this. Okay. Okay, and yeah, I hope you can see my screen properly.
Very well.
Okay. Yep. So thanks, everyone. So this last talk of today's webinar is going to be about CFD modeling of moving parts, and we will be reviewing a case study on mechanical mixing. So let's introduce a bit the topic of mixing in industrial processes. This can be of huge importance in some of these processes when we have a solution that is required to be well mixed. One of the main reasons when we have chemical or biological processes is that usually some of the elements inside the solution are going to be either consumed or being produced and this can create some concentration gradients, right? So the role of mixing here is that it can the movement of the fluid can reduce these concentration gradients, and this can improve the reaction rates and improve the overall process. Also, we can have these cases in which heat is being either created or needed, and yeah, the mixing can also help with dissipation and redistribution of heat along the solution. So, okay, we have many different types of mixing in industrial processes, such as in the last talk with Constanza. We saw that the injection of air in the fluid can also generate some mixing, but I'm going to focus on mechanical mixing with solid parts, and especially in the rotational motion of these mixers, such as an impeller. There are two main techniques that we can have. One is the sliding mesh technique, in which well, once we have created this mesh that we have been talking in the previous talks, right? The mesh is going to be updated every time that we solve it, so in such a way that the mesh will be effectively moving, right? So we'll have some parts of the mesh that are moving with respect to the others. This can help us to stimulate this movement, but it will be also more computationally expensive. Here in this video on the side, we see that the movement of the mesh is like the mesh is really moving, right? Also, another technique is the multiple reference frame, in which we will be using different reference frames, such as we see here, right? We will divide the mesh into two different areas with different reference frames, and well, they will not be moving one reference to the other, but around the boundary between these two, we can emulate the movement in such a way that makes it feasible to study steady state simulations with this technique. Will be less computationally expensive, but also will be sacrificing a bit of accuracy here. So yeah, here in the video we see now how the movement is actually moving out of the zone, but the mesh is not really moving. Okay, so the case study we will be seeing today is about an anaerobic digester. For those of you that are not familiar with anaerobic digestion, is a process, a bioprocess, in which we take waste, such as food waste or wastewater, slurry, or many other things, put them into a digester, which usually is a tank, and then we can produce biogas for energy production, for instance, and also this byproduct called the digestate that can be used as a fertilizer or some other things. So usually in this tank where the anaerobic digestion is taking place, we require a well mixed solution, and we find that the higher the mixing, usually the better the biogas production we will get, but also of course the higher the mixing, the more energy the mixer will be consuming, right? So we can think about this something like this, in which we get the higher the mixing, this red line that is showing us the biogas production is going to increase up to a certain point, right? But also the higher the mixing, the consumption we see here in blue is going to increase. So if we take the net system power that is being produced, right, as the difference between those two, we see that theoretically we should be able to find an optimum point, right, in which some kind of medium mixing would be optimal, and we can optimize the process in such a way. So here this study was done for a company called Procicla, in which they have designed this digester. They had also they wanted to test if this impeller that they have taken was going to be enough for the mixing of the fluid, and also test a bit the operation conditions that they could use. So the system domain, I'm also going to be showing the tools that we use, and in this case, all of them were open source. So we recreate the system geometry with Blender, which is a 3D modeling tool that is open source, as I said. And this is a bit the dimensions of the system, giving us a total volume of around 28 cubic meters. And so once we have this system geometry, we need to make this mesh, right, that we have been talking about in the previous talks. For that, in this case, we use this tool, also open source, that is called CF Mesh. And yeah, here we have a snapshot of the mesh, and we see that it have different refinement levels at different points. Most of it, the most refined region is that close to the impeller, because it's where more resolution is being needed. In this case, we have over 1 million elements, which is already quite heavy mesh. Okay, and so for the configuration of the model, we will be using also an open source software that has been talked about before, right? Is this OpenFOAM. And in this case, the model will have some assumptions, as we have also heard before. And we are going to take a model that will take only single phase fluid. We will only simulating the fluid, the liquid part of the mixing. Also, it will be non-Newtonian due to the properties of the of the influence that will be taken into the tank. Also, we'll have turbulent flow. The simulation will be transient and incompressible, and we'll be using this sliding mesh approach. And just to give you a hint, also of the computational cost is around 5 hours per second of simulation using 70 GPUs. So as well, it's not a cheap simulation. And okay, so once we have running this simulation, we have to make sure, as Robert said, many things that have to be controlled to make sure that the results we're getting are feasible. And yeah, among many things, one of the most logical or easy things to understand that we have to monitor is, for example, the maximum speed of the system. Intuitively, we can think that the faster moving part of the system should be the tip of the impeller, right? Because it would be the one that is moving faster, and we can calculate the speed of this element. And we see in this case would be around 4 meters per second. Also, we have this effect that the fluid behind the tip of the impeller will create this turbulence and recirculation area. And yeah, so we should see that the higher speed of the system is going to be located over there. And if we color the cells that have a velocity higher than a given threshold, we see that as we increase the speed, we are locating more and more this area just on the tip of the impeller. So as I said, just is a easy example to see, but some of the things that we have to monitor to make sure that the results we are getting are make physical sense, right? Okay, so also once we have the simulation run for some time, we can estimate the power consumption as well, also as in the case before that in the question that Joe was answering, right? We run the transient simulation up to a point when we see that the flow patterns are not evolving anymore, not changing anymore, and we can take this flow field and estimate that it's going to keep constant in time, right? This is an assumption that we make, but yes, something that we can work with. And with that, we can estimate the power consumption in the system through the torque. So the torque is a magnitude that can be calculated in the surface of the impeller. We can do this with OpenFOAM, also some other techniques, but yeah, this is something necessary to calculate the power consumption. So in this case, we were simulating 200 RPMs for the impeller, and this gives us a mechanical power consumption of 144 watts. So just for the mechanical part, so not taking into account any of the efficiencies that the motor system can have or the any of the electricity deployment all the way to there. And so another software that we usually use is ParaView, and this software is being used to post-process and also to visualize the results of the CFD simulation. Here we have a representation of the flow field. As we see, the fluid is being ejected through the area where the impeller is, and then it's created this recirculation zone. And we also see that the closer we get to the impeller, also the faster the fluid is moving, right? And so one of the things we can do now with this flow field that we will consider stationary from now on is to simulate the evolution of different tracer distributions, and this can also give us a hint of how the fluid is behaving in different regions of the tank. So here we have some simulations in which we see how this is evolving. Okay, and now what becomes interesting in this specific problem is that we are interested in seeing how it's going to evolve the matter that we're going to put into the inlet of the tank, right? There will be like a door that we will put all the waste products that we want to put into the anaerobic digestion, and this has to have a certain location inside the tank. So doing this type of simulation, we can actually see how this will evolve, and also we can quantify how long it will take to reach a certain level of mixing, right? And thinking about that, we came up with this idea of actually making a quantity about it. So if we think about the given a volume of tracer and the volume of the total system, we can estimate will be the concentration in a perfectly mixed tank with this volume, and then with this we will get a given value for this perfectly mixed distribution, and we can evaluate which is the volume that has concentration which is lower, I mean higher or equal to this distribution. And with that, we see a rising graph, right? Because that means that every part of the volume which has a concentration which is higher than the one that we have established will be already, we can think of it of how homogenized already. So the good thing about this is that this curve that they are creating, it will only depend on the location of the influent and also the operating conditions that we have in our tank, meaning like the rotational speed of the impeller. And with that, we can get a way to quantify, for instance, the time that it takes to homogenize the 80% of the volume of the tank or 90%. And repeating the process for another operating condition, we could also do it, for instance, for another location of the influent. We can start to compare the different behavior that we will find here. In this case, we see for the comparison for 280 RPMs against these 200 RPMs. And with this, we were able to simulate the different operating conditions that the given impeller that this company were going to use. We could compare them and quantify the mixing time it will take for the location of the influent. Also, we can evaluate the difference in the mechanical power consumption that we will get, and we see that this also does not scale linearly as was also expected. Okay, so leaving the CFD simulation, now we could make to estimate the biogas production from this. We could use a compartmentalization method that I'm just going to introduce because otherwise it will take too much time. So the workflow will be just as follows. Once we have the real system and our CFD model, We have run it up to steady state, iterating through the fluid equations. And once we have this steady state, we can post-process it in what's a compartmentalization process that will give us a reduced representation of the system. Because, well, the problem to simulate the biogas production is that this biogas process will take, this anaerobic digestion process will take several days, right? And we cannot run the CFD simulation for so long. So we need a way to couple these two processes with different time step requirements. And this compartmentalization can give us a reduced representation of the system, but that also will be based on the steady state that we have and will somehow capture the fluid dynamics that we have inside the model. And once we have this reduced representation of the system, we will be able to solve all the kinetic equations that we have for the anaerobic digestion process, and with that estimate the biogas production and find that optimum that we were talking about in the beginning. So yeah, overall to conclude, just to say that CFD simulation, as we have seen, can give us very detailed information about many things that we want to evaluate in the fluid. Well, some of those are like the power consumption that we can test in a simulation such as this. And then also once we have the stationary flow field, we can start to do some other stuff like the transport of the tracer distributions, and also use the compartmentalization method to couple it with these more long-lasting processes such as the anaerobic digestion. Okay, so that would be it for my talk. So yeah, back to you, Andres.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you for talking about one of the big challenges in CFD modeling that a lot of people ask. Oh, what about the reaction, the chemical reaction, the biological reaction? Can those be integrated into the CFD? And there are several techniques. There's still a work in progress for a lot of research institutions and companies as well. So yeah, that's a big challenge that we are trying to overcome. So just to conclude, couple questions from the audience or from the speakers as well. I may start with the first one that I have about the boundary conditions. So in case of, for instance, the system that Joe and Rob were showcasing, like the cyclones, the reactors, those tubes, those are enclosed systems. In your case, you have a chunk of the ocean, or basically. So which kind of treatment did you apply for the boundaries? Because the boundaries are, in this case, are kind of like fictional. They're not there.
Yeah, so we have the boundary where we have the current coming into the system. So that is a velocity profile that allows us to capture different like layers of the sea with different velocities. And also the other borders where we will have the marine current coming out of the system, those are considered like if there were more domain surrounding this small domain that we are modeling. So it's like a zero gradient. So it's not like a wall or an empty space. It's assuming that we have more sea beyond these boundaries.
Okay. Okay. Maybe Fernando, you have a question for anybody, or Constanza? Okay.
Maybe just to mention, because Tomas Bermudez asked also about the free surface before, and when it is necessary to include. So it will depend on what you want to study. For example, Dr. Hayes showed a reactor where we could see a surface vortex. In that case, you cannot use a free surface like simulation. It cannot be assumed a flat water level, because you want to recreate that vortex. But in the case, for example, of desalination or aquaculture, Desalination, really. Maybe that surface is not as important, so you can just use like a flat surface, assuming that there are not waves, no water movement in that level. It will depend on what you want to study.
Okay, thank you for compliment that question made asked by Thomas a bit ago. Fernando, I saw that your simulations ran for over 3-4 hours. So can you explain a little bit the technique that you use to pull that off? We know that CFD simulation, Connie was showing like simulations for 10-15 seconds, and it took her weeks. So in this case, what was the technique that you used to extend those simulations over millions of seconds? Sorry, thousands of seconds.
Yeah, so just as Joe said before, what we're doing here is to get also a transient simulation that will, I think we run it for around 30-40 seconds, something like that. And once we see that the flow behavior is not changing anymore, we see that the momentum inside the fluid, overall momentum is not changing anymore, we can consider that it has reached a stationary point. We have a stationary flow field. We also can track the speed in different points, or many different criteria to see if we have reached that point. And what makes really expensive of these simulations actually is to solve the complex fluid equations, right? So once we have this stationary or pseudo-stationary flow field, we can just freeze that and do not recalculate the fluid equations anymore, and just calculate this transport equation, for instance, for the scalar. And this of course is an assumption that we are making, but this way we can extend these simulations for hours of the process, for instance. And yeah, this is the way we have done it.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. So Tomas, thank you, Constanza. Fernando, is it possible to apply geometric symmetries in mixing simulations to save on computational cost, considering the presence of the rotating assembly?
Yeah, I've seen some places where you do that. For instance, with some cylindrical tanks in which you can apply these boundary conditions, assuming that there is a rotational symmetry along an axis. But I would say in the specific case that we have shown, I think you cannot, but mainly also because the boundary that you have does not have any kind of symmetry. So yeah, I think in this specific case it was not possible, but in some other cases where you have this rotational symmetry, for instance, I think it can be applied, yes.
But I think the presence of turbulence makes it more difficult to assume symmetry, right? Any comment on that?
Yeah, of course, if you do that, you are also making an assumption, as we have been talking before, right? But as Robert said, sometimes you don't have the perfect model, just a model that is usable and can help you reach the objective that you want. So yeah, it's always a trade-off.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So as we come to the end of this session, I'd like to thank each of our speakers for their valuable contribution and insights. So your expertise has truly demonstrated the transformative potential of CFD and industrial applications. I'm really grateful for being here and for having presented your work, real cases, real industrial application, added value to the industry. So a big thank you to all of you for your time and engagement. If you'd like to revisit today's webinar or share it with colleagues, we'll be providing a recording soon. So stay tuned for details in your inbox. Thank you again, and we look forward to see you in the future. We are going to be throwing events like that in the forthcoming future as well. So have a great day and evening or whatever, whatever you are. Okay. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.